Expansion upwards. A brief survey of the changes to Swift Current's business districts to the end of the 1980s. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux bands of the Ojibwe people, Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. I would like to thank the City of Swift Current, Sask Culture, Sask Lotteries, and as well as Young Canada Works for making this programming possible. Throughout its many years as a settlement, town, and city, Swift Current has always been a hub for business. In 1883, Swift Current's future location was a Canadian Pacific Railway divisional point, meaning that the station offered much more than just a train station. It was a stopping point because it was halfway between Moose Jaw and Medicine Hat, and it had plenty of water needed by the steam engines. A roundhouse was built to service these engines, as well as turn them around. Taking this into account, the train station was Swift Current's first main business hub. The train station was the first thing that newcomers to the area saw when they got off. And the station itself featured lodging above the passenger depot. The CPR dining hall provided food for CPR staff and travelers. Additionally, all community gatherings and initial church services among settlers in the area took place in the hall, making it a significant cultural hub as well. For trading, prospective merchants had to look no further than the Fraser Timms store and the Curry Brothers store, just across the way from the station to the north. Timms store opened in the winter of 1882, and the Curry store followed, and they both serviced passengers from the train station themselves until 1888. Unfortunately, the business sector of the area did not expand until after 1903, when more people started to settle in the area. Swift Current's first two stores were not very profitable, and eventually traded hands for a few decades. Timms store and building turned into a Dominion Land trading office for William Milburn in 1892, and the Curry store turned into Charles Reed's cash store until it closed in 1911. Despite both of these stores' very short history, they were both very important to a very early Swift Current. Other notable stores opened around 1900. Both of these stores I'm about to talk about operated directly north of the train station. We had Mary Stewart's Store and Rooms, pictured in the center of this photo, and former Northwest Mounted Police Constable William Sanders' dairy store to the far right. Although starting as a dairy store, Mr. Sanders also added a bakery to his store before also adding a butchery. When the Imperial Hotel was built in 1903, business slowly began to move slightly north and outwards. This first permanent hotel outside of the rooms above the CPR station was integral for Swift Current achieving village status, and also featured a restaurant and a bar on the main floor. Up to this point, most of the businesses existed solely across from the train station and expanded west and east. But the Imperial's east wall would soon be considered the west side of 11th Avenue, which was changed to Central Avenue around the time that Swift Current became a city in 1914. Along with the Imperial Hotel, the Reliance Hotel, also owned by George Webster, was built a few buildings west on Railway Street. Many wooden stores began to fill in and around these hotels and along railway, but Swift Current's building boom did not officially start until around 1910. This picture from 1906 shows some wooden buildings starting to be built on Central, and a few more households and churches farther north as well. As quickly mentioned before, Homesteaders were not able to settle the land between Medicine Hat and Moose Jaw until 1903. It also took a few years of this news to reach the east, and for prospective settlers to be convinced to make the move themselves. In the period from 1910 to 1914, often called Swift Current's boom years, many brick buildings were built, and smaller wooden stores were upgraded to stone. In 1911, there were 150 business and residential building permits issued in Swift Current for a total value of $180,000. The total in 1912 reached almost $800,000. And in 1913, this total was over $1 million. The total value of building permits issued in 1913 surpassed the total of both Regina and Saskatoon, making Swift Current one of the quickest growing city in the Southwest and of all of Saskatchewan. This picture from 1912 shows how fast these buildings were built. These buildings were built very quick and were also turned into brick buildings. When contrasted with the previous picture from 1906, it's quite impressive how fast Central was built. Quite a few notable buildings were built during this time. These include the Galbraith Block on 1st Avenue Northeast and Railway, the Doonan Block at 51 Central Avenue, the Jaeger Block in the middle of this photo at 28 Cheadle Street, and the Bilbro Block at 45 Central. While most of these businesses held stores owned by the builders at the time, these would eventually transition into multi-business stores or a combination of businesses and apartments. For example, the Galbraith Block was originally Archie Galbraith's store, but after he sold all of his stock and store to Nelson Pletch of Pletch Grocery, Rooney's Pharmacy and the Silver Cafe occupied the main floor, and an assortment of offices and apartments were present on the floor above. In this picture, from sometime in the 1920s, we can see that Dr. J. McLean had an office upstairs. As more offices were needed, the Imperial also started to include many offices and long-term room rentals in their upstairs as well. This picture shows the Great Northern Supply Company burning to the ground in 1911. Soon after this, in the same location, Ridgway Booker and Michael Healy built the Healy Booker Block, now commonly called the Professional Building. This building housed businesses on the first floor and had small apartments on the second and third floors. As more businesses established themselves in Swift Current, more single-person operations, such as real estate agents and lawyers, set up shop in a small office in many of these buildings along Central Avenue. Restaurants in Swift Current first existed on Railway Street across from the CPR Dining Hall, such as the aforementioned Mary Stewart's restaurant, as well as Lee Chong's restaurant, the Paris Cafe, and the Chicago restaurant. The Imperial, Reliance, and York hotels also had restaurants. The Imperial Cafe, as well as the Reliance, served a regular and consistent meal of meat and potatoes throughout the day, attracting a large customer following. This picture shows a building being moved around 1920 on Central Avenue, and a keen eye can spot the bar sign hanging off the Alexandra Hotel on the right. Smaller cafes that were still full restaurants began to pop up along the 100 block of Central, including the Canada Cafe, Venice Cafe, Silver Cafe, New York Cafe, and the Elite Cafe later on in the 40s. More hotels were built and were altered to accommodate the rush of travelers and settlers alike. Originally built as a wooden structure, pictured here, the Alexandra at 57 Central was upgraded to brick during the boom years. 3 other large-scale hotels were built in 1912. The Empress Hotel at 108 Cheadle Street West, pictured here. The Carlton at 122 First Avenue Northwest. And the Healy Hotel, located at 39 Cheadle Street East. For around 20 years, all of these businesses enjoyed profit until the Empress burned to the ground in the winter of 1931. The Healy became not just a hotel for passers-by to stay in, but also a cultural center of early Swift Current, as it provided a place for business deals to take place and coffee to be shared by the community. The Eagle and Lyric Theaters were both built in 1912, with the Eagle being located at 37 Central and the Lyric being located at 225 Central. This picture shows an early production at the Eagle Theater, which was owned by the Eagle Service Club. And eventually, they only showed theater productions. Excuse me, they exclusively showed movies after only doing theater productions. And this is a picture of the Eagle Theater circa 1950, when it was a movie theater. The Lyric was originally built to house vaudeville performances and was also a movie theater after 1917. 202 Central was home to the Unique Theater, built in 1910, and was later renamed the Star Theater in 1913. Like many buildings in early Swift Current, this building had many functions, as the International Order of Oddfellows owned the building itself and had meetings in the upstairs space. The large Princess Royal Opera House opened in 1913 at 215 First Avenue Northeast, and was sold to the Elks for their own use sometime in the 1930s. The first bank in Swift Current was the Union Bank, which was located somewhere around the Eagle Theater on the east side of Central around 1906. This picture shows an upgraded Union Bank on the other side of Central. In this picture, we can see a different Union Bank of Canada building on the left, the original RBC building just right of the center, and also the small Quebec Bank building on the far right. The large Royal Bank of Canada at 42 Central opened in 1911 and had chambers upstairs for the tellers. Swift Current's first school was a transformed boxcar located on the east side of 2nd Avenue Northeast. The building on the far right was a 2-room school built in 1904. As homesteaders and businessmen flooded into the district, both of these schools, along with the original boxcar on the left, filled to capacity. A 2-story school in the center of this photo was built and opened in 1908. And in 1910, another 4-room addition was built to deal with the population boom. Although church services originally took place in the CPR Hall, a Presbyterian church was built downtown. All denominations shared this church before building their own. Sacred Heart Catholic and St. Stephen's Anglican were both on the corner of 2nd Avenue Northeast and Railway East. And here we can see St. Stephen's on the left and the Roman Catholic Church on the right. Knox Presbyterian was located at 223 3rd Avenue Northeast. This church became Knox United after the Methodists and concurring Presbyterians formed a united church in 1946. The original church used for the Methodist Church was moved to Central Avenue for the Salvation Army. Pictured in this photo, you can see it in the top left. Eventually, an impressive Methodist church was built in stone in 1912 on the west block of 2nd Avenue Northeast. Elsewhere, St. Andrew's Presbyterian was built sometime after 1920 on the northeast corner of Central's 300 block, which was quite far away from the current downtown. And the East Side Church of God was built sometime after that on the southwest corner of 300 block Central. Large liveries, or horse stables, existed behind many of the businesses on the east side of Central. Horses were still the main tool of transportation until cars became widely available in the mid-1920s. And the large number of travelers and farmers coming to town, not by train, warranted a vast area to store and to care for them. In comparison to the early days of businesses focusing on the CPR station, much of Swift Current was beginning to stretch up from the railway. While many businesses were still growing and prospering on Railway Street, Central Avenue began to be the main stage for prospective entrepreneurs. No large or recorded businesses existed north of Chaplin for a large amount of time, with the only notable buildings outside of this area being the courthouse, built in 1916, and the two new schools, Central School and Elmwood School, both built in 1914. The areas east and northeast of downtown were Swift Current's earliest residential areas. Many settlers chose to settle in town due to the ease of establishing a business or working for an already established business. Unfortunately, there is quite a sizable gap of time between 1931 and 1950 that there are little to no written records of Swift Current. This might be attributed to the Great Depression, making record keeping not the most important priority for struggling citizens. There is also speculation that not many new businesses were built in this time, as most of the men were off fighting the Second World War. The 1950s and 60s saw another larger boom for Swift Current's population. After local and provincial governments were finished paying for World War II, they had money to reinvest into their communities and infrastructure. Swift Current, one of the moderately sized communities in the Southwest, attracted both monetary investment and couples looking to make a start outside of a large city. One of the most important shifts in Swift Current's development history was the building of the Trans-Canada Highway. Plans for this highway, which stretched coast to coast of all of Canada, began being discussed in 1948, and the Saskatchewan portion was completed in 1957. The new number 1 bypassed Swift Current's downtown a few kilometers north. Until this point, the original and much less spectacular Highway 1 existed on Chaplin Street, and the original number 4 highway ran on Central Avenue. This picture is from the 60s and shows the Highway 1 crossing Central, then the number 4. And this picture was taken in the mid-70s and shows the same crossing just from a different angle. We can see the apartment buildings to the south of the highway in the middle of the photo, as well as many restaurants lining the sides in the middle left. The addition of the Trans-Canada meant that fewer people would be traveling down Chaplin Street. This translated into less business in the downtown, or at least less traffic. Many hotels, gas stations, and food services began building along the highway as they anticipated receiving the high traffic from the highway. The Swift Motel was built at 940 Central in the late 50s and featured 4 cabins that travelers could pull next to and check into with ease. Another hotel built in the early 60s was the Horseshoe Inn at 905 North Service Road East. After looking at the original building plans, you can see how it was creatively made into the shape of a horseshoe, with rooms lining the sides and the offices at the bottom. The co-op built a large shopping mall just north of the highway on the left side of Central, at the same time that the highway was being completed. This mall is now currently known as the Wheatland Mall and still houses the co-op. The co-op was also one of the few businesses to invest in the area south of the railway tracks, which was essentially cut off from the town for much of the 20th century. There were just a few houses along a couple dirt road streets prior to the 1940s and 50s, as you can see by this photo. There were many farms to the southwest, and the 76 ranch took up most of the land from the east and southeast. For all these residents on the south side, most of their business had to be conducted downtown, but it was quite dangerous to cross the tracks as there were still many trains running back and forth. City Council was eventually petitioned by Southside civilians to build a crossing bridge across the railway in 1931. This bridge was only slightly safer than crossing the tracks, as it was not very sturdily built, but it was still a better option than trying to cross the tracks. The construction of Oman School on the land donated from 76 Ranch shepherd John Oman, and the emergence of a few small corner stores made the trips to downtown less frequent than before for residents and students of the South Side. The overpass across the railway was finally completed in 1960, and the South Side was officially connected to the rest of the city. The co-op bought a parcel of land that is home to its gas station and grocery today, and was formerly home to the Mohawk gas station on the south side. All the apartments that line that block of land still stand. But perhaps the largest investment to Swift Current, and to its downtown in particular, was the Plaza Shopping Center. Although there was originally residential housing on the left side of Central on the 300 block, all of these began to become vacant in the early 60s. A building permit to build the plaza was filed in late 1963 by the owner, Green Enterprises, out of Calgary, and the plaza officially opened in 1965. Featuring a large amount of both visible storefront and office space in the interior, it was a fresh addition to the downtown area at the time. It is speculated that the plaza was planned to be built on the entire left side of the block, but there was one building, the East Side Church, on the southwest corner, that the owners did not want to sell or move. Less than 10 years later, the church moved out of that location, and the Royal Bank of Canada built their new, more centralized banking location at 302 Central Avenue North. The development of the 300 block continued. All of the residential houses on the east side were either torn down or repurposed into other assorted businesses by the mid-1970s. In this picture of a parade from the early 70s, and to the far left, we can see the Swift Current Clinic that opened up in 1971. Slightly south of that location, we have Shaheen's, which also housed Shaheen's Rent-A-TV and Friesen's Furniture. Further down south, we also have the Niagara Finance Building and the Dental Arts Clinic. In the top left, notice the original G.E. Bowers written on the side of the building that was once Bowers Grocery. And on the very bottom corner of that block, on the east side, was the Pacific 66 gas station. Also further down the block was Harold's Imperial gas station, which also got a lot more business in the 1950s and 60s due to slightly more traffic coming downtown due to the population boom. At 77 First Avenue Northeast, the Western Savings Credit Union opened in 1940. This business experienced an unprecedented amount of growth in just 15 years, growing from $1,200 in assets to over $1 million. This eventually led them to build the building that City Hall is currently located in. And just north of the Western Savings Credit Union and east of the Healy, the Cinema Twin Theaters were operated by the Southwest Theater Company and built in 1958. This building featured 2 movie theaters on the main floor and an assortment of offices upstairs. The Young Medical Clinic and the Saskatchewan Municipal Affairs offices operated there until the mid-1970s. As the 50s and 60s passed, Swift Current enjoyed a very busy time of expansion. Businesses grew and improved, and the population had been much higher than just after World War II. Residential areas grew between the highway and Railway Street, and houses began to be built northwest of the highway as well. The industrial area, which was initially just directly west of downtown, expanded even further to the west, as shown in this picture taken in the late 60s and early 70s. Development of industrial areas on the south side, on the southeast, also took place in the early 70s due to the number 4 bypass being completed around that time. All of this expansion was great for the city as a whole, but the attention was beginning to shift away from downtown. It was apparent that the highway was now the biggest channel of traffic through Swift Current by the late 1970s. Businesses downtown experienced a very busy few years, but more and more businesses began to move or start up farther from downtown and settle in other business centers. The former Co-op Mall, or the Wheatland Mall, as well as the Swift Current Mall, pictured here, built in 1981, were also popular centers for businesses to move to and to be seen from by the highway. The former hub of Swift Current, Railway Street, was left in the past. Beginning in the 1960s, the CPR passenger trains operated less and less across Canada, as cars were becoming the main form of transportation. In 1978, the CPR transferred all of its passenger services to Via Rail. Railway Street was no longer the first thing newcomers saw when they arrived in Swift Current. Many of the buildings across the street from the rail station were either vacant or unkempt, and the former beauty of the CPR station garden was no more. All the buildings on the 100 block of Railway Street, pictured here, along with the former W.W. Cooper store and the Co-op store at 28 Central, were demolished in 1982, making way for the new RCMP building and a parking lot. The RCMP, after the Swift Current Police were disbanded in the late 60s, were stationed out of the fire station for over 15 years and unveiled their new building in the fall of 1982. Between the new RCMP building and the overpass, the former Gale-Braith block, now named the Milne block, also fell into disrepair. No businesses occupied the bottom floor, and there were only a few occupants in the apartments upstairs. The once bustling building was torn down in 1988. Up the street, the Healy Hotel was having its own issues. After enjoying more than 40 years of grand service, the Booker family sold the hotel after the city voted against mixed drinking in bars in 1960. Unfortunately for the Booker family, the city voted it through a year after they sold. The hotel and building gradually fell into disrepair due to also a declining number of guests and was demolished in 1988. The Pacific 66 gas station, which is now the current location of CIBC, was torn down in 1982, and Harold's service station, which was on the 200 block of Central, was torn down in 1990 and is now the current home to the Bank of Montreal. The other Grand Hotel, built in 1912, the Carlton, was transformed into apartments in the 50s, but was also torn down after a fire in 2003. Today, Swift Current's downtown is still the central hub of the city, but it is not the only business district anymore. Large and small strip malls line either side of the highway, but not too many lone corner stores exist in neighborhoods anymore. The residential areas in the northwest and northeast continue to be developed and further out, and those closer to the center of town are still being occupied and renovated. Grand buildings, such as the Healy Hotel, Carlton, and Jaeger, no longer stand, but others, like the Imperial Professional Building, still do. Beginning in the 2000s, many businesses and new businesses started to move back to downtown, and we're currently seeing another revitalization stage of the downtown area. Swift Current has long been titled the Southwest Business Hub of Saskatchewan, and looks forward to being called that for years to come.